The soft glow of fairy lights cast a magical aura over the barn at Sparrow Creek Ranch, the air thick with the sweet scent of late-season roses and freshly cut hay. Laughter and the clinking of glasses mingled with the soulful melody of a lone guitarist, a perfect symphony for what was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful forever. Eleanor Vance, radiant in her ivory lace gown, swayed in the arms of her new husband. David, her smile, a beacon of pure, unadulterated joy, was a memory that would soon be seared into the minds of everyone present, a ghost of a happiness that would vanish before the morning sun crested the rolling hills of rural Montana. This was the last time anyone would see her so carefree, so full of life. The night was a blur of heartfelt toasts, exuberant dancing, and the quiet promise of a shared future. Eleanor, a free-spirited artist with a laugh that could fill a room, seemed to be at the pinnacle of her existence. David, a stoic but deeply devoted veterinarian, watched her with an adoration that was palpable to all who witnessed it. Their love story was the stuff of local legend, a whirlwind romance that had blossomed over a shared passion for rescuing stray animals. They had poured their hearts into renovating the old barn, transforming it into the rustic chic venue of their dreams, a testament to their shared vision and hard work. As the evening wore on, the joyous atmosphere began to subtly shift. A cool breeze whispered through the open barn doors, carrying with it the scent of an impending storm. Some guests began to depart, their headlights cutting fleeting paths through the encroaching darkness. Eleanor's maid of honor, her sister, Sarah, recalls a fleeting moment of unease. She seemed a little distracted. Sarah would later tell investigators, her voice barely a whisper. I asked if everything was okay, and she just squeezed my hand and said, "Everything's perfect, just a little overwhelmed." A simple statement, easily dismissed at the time, but one that would later be dissected for any hidden meaning. The final song played, a slow, melancholic ballad that seemed to hang in the air long after the last note faded. The remaining guests offered their final congratulations, their well wishes echoing in the cavernous space. David, ever the doting husband, was seen helping the catering staff clear the last of the tables, a testament to his grounded nature. Eleanor, however, had seemingly vanished from the main festivities. A few guests recalled seeing her near the back of the barn, by the large weathered doors that led out into the sprawling unlit fields. They assumed she was simply taking a moment to herself, to breathe in the night air and the reality of her new life. The last confirmed sighting of Eleanor Vance was by her elderly aunt, who saw her standing near the ornate, leather-bound Guestbook, thoughtful expression on her face. The aunt remembered thinking how beautiful she looked, a solitary figure bathed in the soft, golden light. She had a pen in her hand, as if contemplating one final entry. It was a seemingly insignificant detail, a fleeting snapshot in time, but it would become the focal point of an investigation that would span 2 decades. A silent witness to a bride's final moments of a life she was supposed to have. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, the rain lashing against the tin roof of the barn in a furious rhythm. The remaining members of the wedding party huddled inside, waiting for the downpour to subside. It was during this lull that David's jovial demeanor began to falter. "Has anyone seen Eleanor?" he asked, his voice laced with a thread of concern that would soon unravel into full-blown panic. A quick search of the immediate area yielded nothing. The restrooms were empty, her bridal suite untouched. The sense of unease that had been simmering beneath the surface of the celebration began to boil over. The initial reassurances that she had likely just gone for a short walk, or was with a friend who had already left, quickly lost their conviction. As the minutes ticked by, her purse, containing her phone and keys, was found on the gift table, right where she had left it. The beautiful, handcrafted shawl her grandmother had given her was draped over the back of a chair, a silent, poignant testament to her sudden absence. The joyous celebration had curdled into a scene of confusion and mounting dread. David's frantic calls to his wife's phone went straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring amplifying the growing fear in the pit of his stomach. He and the remaining family and friends fanned out into the rain-soaked darkness, their calls of Eleanor swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. The cheerful fairy lights now seemed to mock them, their twinkling glow illuminating a scene of escalating desperation. The magic of the night had dissipated, replaced by a cold, hard reality. The call to the local sheriff's department was made, Just before dawn, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky in hues of grey and a somber purple, the deputies arrived to a scene of utter bewilderment. A wedding venue, meticulously decorated with symbols of love and new beginnings, was now the epicenter of a baffling mystery. The beautiful bride, who had danced and laughed with such unbridled joy just hours before, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a pristine wedding gown, a heartbroken new husband, and 1,000 unanswered questions. The Guestbook, a repository of well wishes and happy memories, sat on its podium, a silent observer of the night's events. In the frantic initial search, no one had thought to look inside. It was simply another detail in a sea of details, its significance yet to be understood. Little did anyone know that within its pages, amidst the heartfelt messages and congratulatory notes, lay a hidden clue, a cryptic entry that held the key to unlocking the truth of what happened to Eleanor Vance on her wedding night. The first 24 hours of Eleanor Vance's disappearance were a chaotic blur of interviews, search parties, and the dawning, horrific realization that this was not a simple case of a bride getting cold feet. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, more accustomed to dealing with livestock disputes and the occasional bar fight, found themselves at the helm of a major missing persons investigation. The sprawling, rugged terrain surrounding Sparrow Creek Ranch became a massive grid for search teams, their bright orange vests a stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the Montana landscape. The incessant rain had turned the fields into a muddy quagmire, hampering their efforts and washing away any potential tracks. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weathered face told the story of a lifetime spent under the vast Montana sky, took personal charge of the case. He had known Eleanor since she was a little girl, a bright artistic soul who always had a kind word for everyone. The thought of her being in harm's way was a personal blow. He sat across from a distraught David Vance, his eyes red-rimmed and his wedding suit now rumpled and stained with mud. "She wouldn't just leave, Sheriff," David insisted, his voice cracking. "Not without her phone, her purse, not without me." His grief was raw and palpable, yet Brody had to maintain a professional distance. In cases like these, the spouse was always the first person of interest. The media descended on the small town of Harmony Creek like a flock of vultures, their satellite trucks and news vans lining the quiet country roads. The story of the vanishing bride was irresistible, a tragic fairy tale gone wrong. Eleanor's smiling face was plastered across television screens and newspaper front pages, her vibrant spirit reduced to a single, haunting photograph. The narrative was set a beautiful young woman, a picture-perfect wedding, and a mysterious disappearance that had all the hallmarks of a made-for-TV movie. The national attention brought a new level of pressure to the investigation, but it also generated a flood of tips, most of which led to dead ends. Investigators meticulously combed through the wedding barn, searching for any clue, any anomaly, that could shed light on Eleanor's last known hours. They dusted for fingerprints, collected stray hairs, and photographed every inch of the space. The wedding gifts were catalogued, the catering staff re-interviewed, and the guest list scrutinized. Every person who had been present that night was a potential witness or a potential suspect. The joyous atmosphere of the celebration was now a sterile crime scene. The remnants of love and laughter replaced by the cold, methodical process of a police investigation. The ornate guestbook, a detail that had been overlooked in the initial chaos, was carefully bagged and taken into evidence. To the investigators, it was just another item to be processed, another box to be ticked on their exhaustive checklist. They flipped through its pages, scanning the heartfelt messages from friends and family, wishing you a lifetime of happiness. One entry read, "May your love story be as beautiful as your wedding day," said another. They were a poignant collection of well wishes, a testament to the love and support that surrounded the couple. There was nothing, at first glance, that seemed out of the ordinary. As the days turned into weeks, the initial flurry of activity began to wane. The search parties were scaled back, the media presence thinned, and a sense of grim resignation settled over Harmony Creek. David Vance, once the grieving husband, found himself under a cloud of suspicion. His alibi was solid. He was seen by multiple people at the barn until the very end of the night, but the lack of any other viable suspects made him an easy target for speculation. He retreated from public life, his grief now compounded by the weight of suspicion and the constant whispers of the town. The investigation stalled. With no body, no ransom note, and no credible witnesses to her abduction. The case quickly went cold. Sheriff Brody, despite his best efforts, was forced to reallocate resources to more pressing matters. The case file on Eleanor Vance, filled with hundreds of pages of interviews, reports, and dead-end leads, was relegated to a dusty filing cabinet, a silent testament to a mystery that refused to be solved. For 20 long years, the file would remain there, a ghost in the machine of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department. Eleanor's family, particularly her sister Sarah, refused to let her memory fade. They held annual vigils, maintained a website dedicated to her disappearance, and periodically pleaded with the public for any information. Sarah, a woman whose life had been irrevocably altered by that stormy night, became a fierce advocate for her missing sister. She would often revisit the barn at Sparrow Creek Ranch, now a silent, empty space, a monument to a love that was never allowed to blossom. She would stand by the large barn doors, staring out at the fields, as if hoping to see Eleanor walking back towards her. Her infectious laugh carried on the wind. The wedding guestbook, a relic from a day that had promised so much, was eventually returned to Eleanor's parents. They tucked it away in a cedar chest, unable to bring themselves to look at the joyful messages from a life that had been so cruelly cut short. It became a symbol of their unresolved grief, a painful reminder of the daughter they had lost. They had no idea that, hidden within its pages, in plain sight, was the one clue that could have broken the case wide open, a cryptic message that had been waiting patiently for 2 decades to be understood. It wasn't until 20 years later, when a young, ambitious detective, newly assigned to the cold case unit, decided to take a fresh look at the Eleanor Vance file, that the guestbook would once again see the light of day. He was looking for something, anything that had been missed. He requested all the original evidence, every scrap of paper, every photograph. And when he opened the old, leather-bound guestbook, he noticed something no one had noticed before: a single, anomalous entry, written in a different hand. A message that was not a well-wish, but a warning. Detective Miles Corbin was a new breed of law enforcement, a millennial with a penchant for digital forensics and a fresh perspective on old-school police work. He had grown up in the shadow of the Eleanor Vance case, a local legend that had haunted his hometown for as long as he could remember. When he was assigned to the newly formed cold case unit, he knew exactly which file he wanted to pull first. He believed that with a fresh set of eyes and the advancements in technology, he could uncover something that had been missed, a small detail that could unravel the entire mystery. Corbin spent weeks poring over the original case file, familiarizing himself with every witness statement, every photograph, every dead-end lead. He was struck by the sheer volume of information and the lack of any concrete evidence. It was as if Eleanor had simply vanished into thin air. He interviewed the original investigators, now retired. Their memories of the case faded but still tinged with frustration. He spoke with Eleanor's family, their grief still raw even after 2 decades. He felt the weight of their expectation, their desperate hope that he could be the one to finally bring them answers. It was during his meticulous review of the physical evidence that he'd stumbled upon the guestbook. It was a beautiful, handcrafted item, its leather cover embossed with the couple's initials. He carefully turned each page, reading the heartfelt messages, a poignant time capsule of a joyous occasion that had turned so tragic. He was about to close it when he noticed something odd. On the very last page, tucked away in the corner, was an entry that was different from the others. It was written in a hurried, almost frantic scroll, a stark contrast to the neat cursive that filled the rest of the book. The message was short and cryptic. "The owl sees in the dark. I'll be waiting at the old mill." It wasn't signed. The ink was slightly smeared, as if written in haste. Corbin's heart quickened. This was not a well-wish. It was a clandestine message, a secret communication hidden in plain sight. He immediately cross-referenced the entry with every witness statement in the file. No one had mentioned an old mill. No one had mentioned an owl. It was a completely new piece of information, a thread that had been dangling, unnoticed, for 20 years. Corbin immediately sent the guestbook to the state crime lab for a full forensic analysis. He wanted to know everything about that single, cryptic entry. He requested a handwriting analysis, an ink analysis, and a search for any latent fingerprints. He knew it was a long shot after so many years, but it was the first real lead the case had seen in 2 decades. While he waited for the results, he began his own investigation into the mysterious message. He scoured old maps of Lincoln County, searching for any location that was known as the Old Mill. His research led him to a derelict grist mill, located about 5 miles from Sparrow Creek Ranch, deep in a heavily wooded area. It had been abandoned for decades, a crumbling ruin that was a popular spot for local teenagers to hang out. It was a place that was not on any official maps, a location that you would only know about if you were a local. The mention of the owl also piqued his interest. He discovered that the area around the old mill was a known nesting ground for the great horned owl, a nocturnal predator known for its silent flight and keen eyesight. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a tantalizing, albeit incomplete, picture. The forensic report from the crime lab came back with a bombshell. The handwriting on the cryptic note did not match Eleanor David's or any of the other wedding guests whose signatures were in the book. It was an unknown hand. But the most significant finding was the ink. It was a specific type of archival ink commonly used by artists and draftsmen. This narrowed down the potential author of the note to someone with a creative or professional background that would require such a specific tool. Corbin now had 2 crucial pieces of new information: a secret meeting place and a potential clue about the person who wrote the note. He revisited the guest list, this time looking for anyone who was an artist, an architect, or had any profession that might use archival ink. He cross-referenced this list with individuals who had a known connection to Eleanor, particularly anyone who might have had a secret relationship with her. The investigation, which had been dormant for so long, was suddenly buzzing with new life. The discovery of the note also cast a new light on David Vance. If Eleanor was planning to meet someone in secret on her wedding night, it suggested a level of deception that David had always vehemently denied. Had he known about this secret meeting, was it possible that his grief-stricken husband act was just that, an act? Cloud of suspicion that had followed him for 20 years suddenly grew darker. Corbin knew he had to tread carefully. He was dealing with a man who had already been through an unimaginable ordeal, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that he was hiding something. The Guestbook, which had been a symbol of lost love and unresolved grief, had now become the key to unlocking a 20-year-old secret. It was a silent witness that was finally beginning to speak, its cryptic message echoing from the past. Detective Corbin, with his fresh eyes and modern techniques, was determined to listen to what it had to say. He was on the verge of uncovering a truth that was far more complex and sinister than anyone had ever imagined, a truth that had been buried for 2 decades, waiting for someone to find the ghost in the Guestbook. Armed with the new lead from the Guestbook, Detective Corbin delved back into the original case files, viewing them through a new lens. The cryptic message about the old mill and the owl forced him to re-examine every witness statement, every alibi, every seemingly insignificant detail from that fateful wedding night. He was no longer just looking for a missing person. He was looking for a secret, a hidden narrative that had been playing out in the shadows of the celebration. The whispers of the past, once faint and easily dismissed, were now amplified, demanding to be heard. Corbin started by creating a detailed timeline of Eleanor's movements on her wedding day, cross-referencing the accounts of dozens of guests. A picture emerged of a bride who was not just happy, but also, at times, deeply preoccupied. Several guests, when re-interviewed, recalled fleeting moments of tension between Eleanor and her mother, a strained conversation that was quickly smoothed over with forced smiles. Her sister, Sarah, admitted that Eleanor had been receiving a series of hushed phone calls in the week leading up to the wedding, calls she had dismissed as wedding-related stress. These were the threads that had been ignored, the small cracks in the perfect facade. The focus of the investigation naturally shifted to identifying the author of the cryptic note. The use of archival ink was a significant clue, pointing towards someone with an artistic or professional background. Corbin and his team meticulously went through the wedding guest list of over 200 names, researching the profession of each individual. The task was laborious, a painstaking process of digging through old records and social media profiles. They were looking for an artist, an architect, a writer, anyone who might have had both the means and the motive to communicate with Eleanor. In secret, the investigation led them to a man named Julian Croft, a guest on David's side of the family, a distant cousin who worked as a freelance architectural illustrator. He was known for his beautiful, detailed renderings of buildings, a profession that would have required the use of high-quality, archival ink. When Corbin looked at Croft's original statement from 20 years ago, it was brief and unremarkable. He claimed to have left the wedding early, around 10 p.m., and had gone straight back to his hotel. His alibi was flimsy, uncorroborated, but at the time, he was not considered a person of interest. Corbin decided to pay a visit to Julian Croft, who now lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in a neighboring state. Croft, now in his late 50s, was a man who seemed to have been worn down by life, his once bright eyes now dull and evasive. When Corbin brought up the Eleanor Vance case, a flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed Croft's face. He initially denied knowing anything, sticking to his original story. But as Corbin pressed him, presenting him with a copy of the cryptic note from the Guestbook, Croft's composure began to crumble. He recognized the handwriting. It was his dot. The confession that followed was not one of murder, but of a long-buried secret. Julian Croft admitted that he and Eleanor had been having an affair. It had started a year before the wedding, a passionate, clandestine relationship that was born out of a shared sense of being outsiders in their own families. He was the one who had been calling her in the week leading up to the wedding, begging her to call it off, to run away with him. He had written the note in the Guestbook as a last, desperate plea, a final attempt to convince her to meet him. The old mill, he explained, was their secret meeting place, a spot they had discovered together on one of their clandestine excursions. The reference to the owl was an inside joke, a nod to their shared love of nature and the nocturnal birds that inhabited the woods around the mill. He had waited for her for hours that night, huddled in the crumbling ruin, the storm raging around him, but she never came. He eventually gave up, assuming she had chosen David, and had left town the next day, racked with guilt and heartbreak. Croft's confession was a seismic shift in the investigation. It provided a motive for Eleanor to have voluntarily left her own wedding. It explained her distracted demeanor and the hushed phone calls, but it also raised a host of new questions. If she was planning to meet Julian, what had stopped her? And if he had nothing to do with her disappearance, as he vehemently claimed, then who did? The timeline had a new, crucial element, but the final, tragic piece of the puzzle was still missing. The revelation of the affair was a devastating blow to Eleanor's family and to David Vance. For 20 years, he had mourned the loss of his perfect wife, the love of his life. To learn that she had been deceiving him, that she was planning to meet another man on their wedding night, was a betrayal that cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. His grief was now tainted with anger and a profound sense of disillusionment. The woman he thought he knew, the life he thought they were going to build together, had all been a lie. Corbin, while sympathetic to David's pain, knew that this new information was crucial. The focus of the investigation had now shifted away from a random act of violence or a simple case of a runaway bride. It was now a story of love, betrayal, and a secret that had been kept for 2 decades. The Guestbook had unlocked the first door, but there were more to open. The path to the truth was becoming clearer, but it was also leading them into a darkness that was far more complex and treacherous than anyone had anticipated. Julian Croft's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation, forcing Detective Corbin to reevaluate every assumption he had made about the case. The narrative of a blissful bride whisked away into the night was shattered, replaced by a far more complicated story of a woman torn between 2 men. Croft's account of their secret affair provided a plausible explanation for Eleanor's disappearance from the wedding reception, but it didn't explain what happened to her after she failed to show up at the old mill. His story, while compelling, needed to be thoroughly vetted. Corbin and his team launched a deep dive into Julian Croft's life, both past and present. They subpoenaed his phone records from the time of the disappearance, hoping to find some digital breadcrumbs that could corroborate his story. They re-interviewed his friends and family, searching for any hint of a violent temper or a history of obsessive behavior. On the surface, Croft appeared to be a mild-mannered, almost timid man, an unlikely suspect for a violent crime. But Corbin knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially when it came to crimes of passion. The forensic analysis of the Guestbook provided further corroboration for Croft's story. The ink from the cryptic note was a perfect match to a set of pens found in a dusty box in his attic, a brand he had favored for his architectural illustrations 20 years ago. The handwriting analysis, while not conclusive due to the small sample size, showed strong similarities to his known handwriting. The physical evidence was aligning with his confession, but Corbin was still wary. Croft had a clear motive for wanting Eleanor to leave her new husband, and his alibi for the night of her disappearance was still uncorroborated. Corbin arranged a second, more intensive interview with Croft. This time at the police station, he wanted to press him on the details of his story, to look for any inconsistencies, any cracks in his carefully constructed narrative. Croft, looking even more haggard than before, stuck to his story. He claimed to have waited at the old mill until almost 3 a.m., his hope dwindling with each passing minute. He described the storm in vivid detail, the lashing rain, the howling wind, the sense of utter desolation as he finally accepted that she wasn't coming. "I loved her," Croft said, his voice thick with an emotion that seemed genuine. "I would never have hurt her. I just wanted her to be with me." He produced a small, worn photograph from his wallet, a picture of him and Eleanor, smiling, taken on a hiking trip months before the wedding. It was a tangible piece of their secret life, a life that had been hidden from everyone. He insisted that after he left the mill, he had driven straight back to his hotel, packed his bags, and checked out at dawn, his heart heavy with the realization that he had lost her forever. The hotel records from 20 years ago confirmed that a Julian Croft had checked out at 6:15 a.m. on the morning after the wedding. It was a small piece of corroboration, but it didn't account for his whereabouts during the crucial hours when Eleanor disappeared. The time between when he claimed to have left the mill and when he checked out of the hotel was a gaping hole in his alibi. Corbin knew that this was the window of opportunity, the time when anything could have happened. As the investigation into Julian Croft intensified, a new and unexpected piece of information emerged. A retired forest ranger, who had been part of the original search party 20 years ago, came forward after seeing a news report about the renewed investigation. He remembered something from the morning after the disappearance, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. He had seen a car, a dark-colored sedan, parked on a deserted logging road not far from the old mill. He hadn't thought much of it then, assuming it belonged to a hunter or a camper. The ranger's tip, combined with Croft's confession, sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. Corbin immediately pulled the original case files, searching for any mention of a dark-colored sedan. He found a statement from one of the wedding guests who had left late, who recalled seeing a car that matched the description parked near the entrance to Sparrow Creek Ranch. The pieces were starting to connect, forming a chain of evidence that was leading them closer to the truth. The lover's gambit, his desperate attempt to win Eleanor back, had failed, but it had set in motion a chain of events that had led to her disappearance. The question that remained was whether he was a spurned lover who had turned violent, or an unwitting pawn in a much larger, more sinister game. The investigation had reached a critical turning point. They had a new suspect, a new timeline, and a new location of interest. The old mill, once a symbol of a secret love, was now a potential crime scene. Corbin knew that he had to get a search warrant for the old mill and the surrounding area. It was a long shot after 20 years, but it was their best chance of finding any physical evidence that could either implicate or exonerate Julian Croft. The whispers of the past had led them to a new, promising lead. The Guestbook had not only revealed a secret lover, but it had also pointed them in the direction of a place where the final act of this tragedy may have unfolded. The next chapter of the investigation would take them deep into the woods, to a place where secrets had been buried for 2 decades. The search warrant for the old mill and the surrounding property was granted, and Detective Corbin assembled a team of forensic experts, search and rescue volunteers, and law enforcement officers. The sense of anticipation was palpable as they drove down the winding, overgrown logging road that led to the derelict structure. The mill, a skeletal ruin of rotting timber and rusted metal, stood as a silent, foreboding monument to a bygone era. For Corbin, it felt like they were stepping back in time, into the final desperate hours of Eleanor Vance's life. The search was a meticulous, painstaking process. The team established a grid pattern, slowly and methodically combing through every inch of the property. They used ground-penetrating radar to search for any anomalies in the soil, any sign of a clandestine grave. The interior of the mill was a scene of decay and neglect, littered with debris and the remnants of decades of illicit gatherings. The forensic team carefully sifted through the detritus, looking for anything that could be linked to Eleanor or Julian Croft. It was a needle in a haystack search, but Corbin was determined to leave no stone unturned. Days turned into a week, and the search yielded nothing. The initial optimism began to wane, replaced by a familiar sense of frustration. It seemed that the old mill, like so many other leads in this case, was another dead end. Corbin was beginning to think that Croft's story, while emotionally compelling, was just that, a story, a clever misdirection designed to throw them off the scent. But just as he was about to call off the search, a young volunteer working his way along the muddy bank of the creek that ran alongside the mill noticed something glinting in the shallow water. He carefully reached into the murky depths and pulled out a small, delicate object, a silver locket, tarnished and caked with mud. He wiped it clean, and as he did, his breath caught in his throat. It was engraved with the initial E. Corbin rushed to the scene, his heart pounding in his chest. He recognized the locket immediately from the wedding photographs. It was the one Eleanor's grandmother had given her, a family heirloom she was wearing on her wedding night. It was the first piece of physical evidence directly linking Eleanor to this location. That discovery of the locket galvanized the search team. They now had a specific area to focus on, a point of origin from which to expand their search. They brought in cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect the scent of human remains, even after decades of decomposition. The dogs, their noses to the ground, led the team away from the mill, further down the creek, to a secluded, densely wooded area that had not been part of the original search grid. It was a place that was almost inaccessible, hidden from view by a thick canopy of trees and a tangle of undergrowth. It was there, in a shallow makeshift grave, hidden beneath a pile of rocks and branches, that they found what was left of Eleanor Vance. The discovery was a somber, heartbreaking moment. After 20 years of uncertainty, of hoping against hope, the search for Eleanor was finally over. The mystery of her disappearance had been solved, but it had given way to a new, more horrifying question. Who had put her there? The cause of death was not immediately apparent, but it was clear that she had been the victim of a homicide. The discovery of Eleanor's remains sent a fresh wave of grief through her family and the community of Harmony Creek. The faint hope that she might one day return, that there was some other explanation for her disappearance, was extinguished forever. For her sister, Sarah, it was a devastating blow, but it also brought a strange sense of closure. "At least now we know," she said, her voice choked with tears. "Now we can finally bring her home." David Vance, when informed of the discovery, retreated further into his self-imposed isolation. The news of his wife's murder, and the confirmation of her affair, a double blow that left him utterly broken. For Detective Corbin, the discovery of the body was a major breakthrough, but it was also the beginning of a new phase of the investigation. He now had a crime scene, a victim, and a prime suspect in Julian Croft. The circumstantial evidence against him was mounting. He had a motive, he had a secret connection to the victim, and he was the last person to have planned to see her alive. The discovery of her body near the location where he claimed to have waited for her was a damning coincidence. Corbin brought Julian Croft in for another round of questioning. This time, the stakes were much higher. He was no longer just a person of interest. He was the primary suspect in a homicide investigation. When confronted with the news of the discovery of Eleanor's body, Croft's reaction was one of genuine shock and horror. He broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. He continued to deny any involvement in her death, insisting that he had left the mill alone. His heart broken but his hands clean. The case against Croft was strong, but it was still circumstantial. There was no direct physical evidence linking him to the murder. The locket could have been lost at any time. The location of the body, while suspicious, was not definitive proof of his guilt. Corbin knew that he needed more. He needed something to break Croft's story, something to connect him directly to the crime. The Guestbook had led them to the truth about Eleanor's secret life, but the final, crucial chapter of this story was yet to be written. The mill by the creek had given up its secrets, but the identity of the killer was still shrouded in doubt. The discovery of Eleanor's body, and the mounting circumstantial evidence against Julian Croft, seemed to be leading the investigation to a logical, albeit tragic, conclusion. The narrative was simple and compelling. A spurned lover, a secret rendezvous gone wrong, a crime of passion buried for 2 decades. The district attorney was confident that they had enough to secure a conviction. But for Detective Corbin, something still felt off. Croft's denials, his raw, unadulterated grief at the news of Eleanor's death, seemed too genuine to be an act. Corbin decided to take one last, hard look at the original prime suspect, the grieving husband, David Vance. For 20 years, David had played the role of the heartbroken victim to perfection. He had mourned his wife, endured the whispers and suspicions of the town, and had lived a quiet, solitary life. But Corbin, looking back at the original case files with the new knowledge of Eleanor's affair, saw a different side to the story. He saw a man who had been publicly humiliated, a man whose picture-perfect life had been shattered in the most public way possible. He saw a man with a powerful motive for revenge. Corbin began to quietly reinvestigate David Vance, digging into his life in the years following Eleanor's disappearance. He discovered that David had sold the veterinary practice he and Eleanor had built together just a year after she went missing. He had moved away from Harmony Creek, severing all ties with their mutual friends. He had never remarried, never even been in a serious relationship. On the surface, it looked like the actions of a man consumed by grief, but Corbin saw it as the behavior of a man trying to escape his past. The key to unraveling David's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source: the financial records from the wedding. Corbin, in a moment of inspired curiosity, decided to subpoena the final invoices from all the wedding vendors. He was looking for anything unusual, any discrepancy that might have been overlooked, and he found it in the final bill from the catering company. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the invoice, an addendum for a last-minute change to the menu, signed by David Vance. Corbin took the signed invoice to a forensic document examiner, the same one who had analyzed the Guestbook. He asked her to compare David's signature on the invoice to the handwriting in the cryptic note written by Julian Croft. The results were inconclusive, as expected. But then Corbin asked her to do something else, something no one had thought to do before. He asked her to analyze the handwriting on every single entry in the wedding Guestbook. It was a long shot, a fishing expedition, but it was a hunch he couldn't ignore. The document examiner spent days meticulously analyzing the hundreds of signatures and messages in the Guestbook, and then she found it. A single entry, a simple, forward message happily ever after, always signed with the name of a distant relative who, upon being contacted, swore they had never written it. The handwriting, the examiner concluded with a high degree of certainty, was a match to David Vance's. He had forged a message in his own wedding Guestbook. It was a small, seemingly insignificant act of deception, but it was a crack in his armor. Armed with this new piece of evidence, Corbin went to see David Vance. He found him living in a small, immaculately clean house on the outskirts of a town 2 states away from Harmony Creek. David was initially polite, almost welcoming, but his demeanor changed when Corbin revealed the real reason for his visit. He confronted David with the forged Guestbook entry, with the inconsistencies in his story, with the rage he must have felt upon discovering his wife's betrayal. David's calm, collected exterior began to crumble. The confession that followed was not a sudden, dramatic outburst, but a slow, agonizing unraveling of a man who had been living a lie for 20 years. David admitted that he had known about Eleanor's affair. He had found a series of letters from Julian Croft hidden in her art studio a week before the wedding. He had been devastated, his world turned upside down, but instead of confronting her, he had decided to go through with the wedding, hoping that she would choose him, that she would end the affair and commit to their life together. On the wedding night, his hopes were shattered. He saw Julian Croft slip the note into the Guestbook. He saw the look on Eleanor's face as she read it. He knew she was going to leave him. He followed her out of the barn, his heart a cold, hard knot of fury and betrayal. He confronted her by the creek, not far from the old mill road. The argument that followed was explosive. A torrent of accusations and recriminations that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. In a fit of rage, David grabbed Eleanor by the arms, shaking her, demanding to know why she had betrayed him. She stumbled backward, her head hitting a large rock on the edge of the creek. The blow was fatal. In an instant, the love of his life was gone, her life extinguished by his own hand. Panicked and horrified by what he had done, he dragged her body into the woods, burying her in a shallow grave. He took her locket, a final twisted memento of the woman he had both loved and destroyed, and threw it into the creek. He had gotten away with it for 20 years. His grief, a perfect cover for his monstrous secret. The unraveling of the husband was complete, a tragic end to a story that had begun with so much promise. David Vance's confession was a chilling, methodical account of a man who had meticulously constructed a false reality for 2 decades. As he spoke, the pieces of the puzzle that had eluded investigators for so long finally fell into place, forming a picture of cold, calculated deception. He recounted the events of that stormy night with a detached, almost clinical precision. The weight of his secret, which he had carried alone for 20 years, finally being lifted. The grieving husband was gone, replaced by a man who had committed the ultimate act of betrayal. He explained how he had used the storm as cover, the driving rain and the chaos of the departing guests providing the perfect opportunity to slip away unnoticed. After killing Eleanor and hiding her body, he had returned to the barn, his suit soaked and muddy, and had feigned a frantic search for his missing bride. His performance was flawless. He had cried real tears, his voice choked, with a grief that was, in a twisted way, genuine. He was grieving the loss of the life he had planned, the woman he had loved, and the man he had once been. The forged entry in the guestbook, he admitted, was a small, almost subconscious act of control, an attempt to rewrite the narrative of their wedding day, to create a perfect memory, to cover the horrific reality. It was a detail so minor, so seemingly insignificant, that he was certain no one would ever notice, and for 20 years, no one had. It was a testament to the depth of his deception, his ability to compartmentalize his guilt and maintain a facade of normalcy. David's confession also exonerated Julian Croft, a man who had been wrongly suspected and had lived under a cloud of guilt for 2 decades. The news of David's arrest was a profound, life-altering moment for Croft. He was finally free from the weight of a secret that had haunted him for half his life. The love he had felt for Eleanor was real, and the pain of her loss was genuine. To know that she had not simply chosen another man, but had been brutally murdered, was a new kind of heartbreak, but it was one that was tinged with a sense of vindication, the community of harmony. Crick was left reeling from the revelation. The story of the vanishing bride had been a local legend for so long, a tragic mystery that had defined their town. To learn that the killer had been living among them, hiding in plain sight, was a betrayal that shook them to their core. The sympathy they had felt for David Vance for 20 years curdled into a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The man they had pitied was a monster. For Eleanor's family, the news was a complex and agonizing mix of emotions. The closure they had so desperately sought had finally come, but it was a brutal, ugly truth. Their daughter had been murdered by the man she had promised to love and cherish. Her sister, Sarah, who had been a tireless advocate for her missing sister, was left to grapple with the knowledge that the man she had once considered a brother-in-law was a killer. The weight of David's secret had not been his alone to bear. It had cast a long, dark shadow over all of their lives. Detective Corbin, the man who had resurrected a cold case and brought a killer to justice, felt a profound sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the tragedy of it all. He had solved the mystery, but he couldn't undo the pain. He had given a family answers, but he couldn't give them back their daughter. The guestbook, the silent witness that had started it all, was now a symbol of both a beautiful beginning and a horrific end. It was a testament to the power of a single, overlooked clue, and a reminder of the secrets that can lie hidden just beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect life. The legal proceedings that followed were a mere formality. David Vance, his confession recorded and corroborated by the physical evidence, pleaded guilty to the murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend the rest of his days with the weight of his secret, a secret that had finally, after 20 long years, been brought into the light. The case of the vanishing bride was officially closed. The media, which had been so captivated by the mystery of Eleanor's disappearance, now had a new, even more sensational story to tell. The headlines screamed of a husband's betrayal, a love story that had ended in murder. The narrative was once again set, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a smiling face. But for those who had known and loved Eleanor, the story was much simpler and much sadder. It was the story of a vibrant, talented young woman whose life had been cut short, a life full of promise that was never allowed to be lived. The barn at Sparrow Creek Ranch, the scene of both a joyous celebration and a brutal crime, was eventually sold and torn down. A new housing development was built on the land, its manicured lawns and identical houses a stark contrast to the wild, untamed beauty of the Montana landscape. But for those who remembered, the ghost of Eleanor Vance would forever linger in the rolling hills and the whispering pines, a silent reminder of a wedding night that had ended in disappearance, and a secret that had taken 20 years to unlock. The conviction of David Vance brought a legal end to the case of the vanishing bride, but for those whose lives were touched by the tragedy, the emotional fallout would linger for years to come. The scars of remembrance, etched deep into their hearts, were a constant reminder of the love, loss, and betrayal that had defined their lives for 2 decades. The truth, when it finally came, was a double-edged sword, providing closure but also inflicting a new kind of pain. Eleanor's family, after finally being able to lay her to rest, began the long, slow process of grieving anew. For 20 years, their grief had been suspended in a state of limbo, a constant, gnawing uncertainty. Now, they were forced to confront the brutal reality of her death, the violence of her final moments, and the profound betrayal of the man they had once welcomed into their family. The image of their vibrant, joyful daughter was now forever intertwined with the dark, ugly truth of her murder. Her sister, Sarah, who had been the driving force behind the continued search for Eleanor, found herself adrift in the aftermath of the trial. Her life's mission, the one thing that had given her purpose for 2 decades, was over. She had found her sister, she had found the truth, but she had lost a part of herself in the process. She struggled to reconnect with the person she was before. The disappearance, to find a new sense of purpose in a world where her sister no longer existed. The scars of her relentless fight for justice were a permanent part of her, a testament to her love and her loss. Julian Croft, the man who had been Eleanor's secret lover, also had to find a way to move forward. The revelation of her murder was a devastating blow, a final, tragic end to their clandestine love story. He was filled with a profound sense of what if, a lifetime of regret for the future they might have had. The guilt he had carried for 20 years, the belief that she had simply chosen another man, was replaced by a different kind of sorrow, a grief for a life that had been stolen from them both. He eventually found a measure of peace, but the memory of Eleanor, and the secret they had shared, would forever be a part of him. The town of Harmony Creek, once united in its sympathy for the grieving husband, was now a community grappling with a collective sense of guilt and betrayal. They had been duped, their compassion manipulated by a man who was a cold-blooded killer. The case became a cautionary tale, a local legend that was passed down from one generation to the next, a reminder of the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected of places. The name Eleanor Vance was now synonymous with a tragedy that had stained the town's history forever. Detective Miles Corbin, the man who had cracked the case, was hailed as a hero. He had succeeded where so many others had failed, his fresh perspective and relentless determination bringing a 2-decade-old mystery to a stunning conclusion. But the case had taken a personal toll on him as well. He had become deeply invested in the lives of the people involved, feeling their pain, their grief, and their eventual, bitter relief. The Eleanor Vance case would forever be a part of his legacy, a defining moment in his career, but it was also a heavy burden to bear. The Guestbook, the object that had been the catalyst for the final, successful investigation, was returned to Eleanor's family. It was a painful artifact, a symbol of both their greatest joy and their deepest sorrow. They couldn't bring themselves to destroy it, but they couldn't bear to look at it either. It was a tangible piece of a past that was too painful to revisit, a silent witness to a story of love, betrayal, and murder. It was a testament to the fact that even in the most beautiful of beginnings, the seeds of a tragic end can be sown. In the years that followed, the story of Eleanor Vance slowly faded from the national headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new mysteries. But for those who were there, for those who lived through it, the memory would never fade. The scars of remembrance were a permanent reminder of a life that was cut short, a love that was betrayed, and a secret that had been buried for far too long. The case was closed, but the story, in many ways, would never truly be over. The old mill, the scene of the planned rendezvous that never was, eventually succumbed to the elements, its crumbling timbers collapsing into a pile of rubble. The creek, where Eleanor's locket was found, continued to flow, its waters washing away the last traces of the tragedy. Nature, in its relentless, indifferent way, was reclaiming the land, erasing the physical reminders of the darkness that had once unfolded there. But the human heart has a longer memory. The final chapter of the Eleanor Vance story was not one of justice or retribution, but of the enduring power of memory and the long, slow process of healing. The scars would always be there, a roadmap of a journey through unimaginable grief and loss, but in time, they would also become a symbol of resilience, of the ability of the human spirit to endure even the most profound of tragedies. The whispers of the past had finally been silenced, replaced by the quiet, somber hum of remembrance. Years after the trial and the sentencing of David Vance, a fragile peace settled over the lives of those left in the wake of the tragedy. The raw, open wound of Eleanor's murder had begun to scar over, leaving behind a permanent, indelible mark on their souls. The story, once a screaming headline, had softened into an echo in the rolling hills of Montana, a somber melody carried, on the wind, a permanent part of the local lore. The search for answers was over, but the search for meaning, for a way to live with the truth, continued. Sarah, Eleanor's sister, found her path forward not by trying to forget, but by choosing to remember her sister not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. She established a foundation in Eleanor's name, a non-profit organization that provided scholarships to young, aspiring artists from rural communities. It was a way to keep Eleanor's vibrant, creative spirit alive, to turn a senseless tragedy into a force for good. The foundation became her life's work, a testament to a sister's enduring love. Julian Croft, a secret lover who had been haunted by what-ifs, eventually found a measure of solace. He channeled his grief and regret into his art, creating a series of poignant architectural renderings of abandoned places, of buildings that, like his love for Eleanor, had been left to crumble in the face of time. His work was infused with a new depth, a melancholic beauty that resonated with critics and collectors alike. It was his way of honoring her memory, of giving voice to the silent, secret world they had once shared. David Vance, confined to the cold, sterile reality of a maximum security prison, became a ghost of a man. The weight of his crime, the 2 decades of deception, had finally crushed him. He refused all visitors, spoke to no one, his life reduced to a monotonous routine of regret and remorse. The love he had once felt for Eleanor had twisted into a monstrous, obsessive guilt that consumed his every waking moment. He would live out the rest of his days in a self-imposed silence, a prisoner of his own making long before the bars of his cell closed behind him. Detective Miles Corbin, the man who had brought the truth to light, continued his work in the cold case unit. Driven by the memory of the Eleanor Vance investigation, he had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of truth, about the importance of looking beyond the obvious, of listening to the whispers of the past. He knew that every cold case file held a story waiting to be told, a family waiting for answers, a victim waiting for justice. The echo of Eleanor's story became his guiding principle, a reminder of the profound human impact of his work. The town of Harmony Creek, once scarred by the betrayal, slowly began to heal. The story of the vanishing bride became a part of their collective identity, a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the capacity for darkness that exists even in the most idyllic of settings. The annual town fair, once a source of painful memories, was reclaimed by the community, a celebration of their resilience, of their ability to come together in the face of tragedy. The echo in the hills was a part of them, but it no longer defined them. The wedding guestbook, the silent witness that had unlocked the truth, was eventually placed in a glass case in the local historical society, a permanent exhibit in the town's small museum. It was a strange, poignant artifact, a symbol of a day that had held so much promise and had ended in such profound sorrow. Visitors would often stop to look at it, to read the joyful messages, to see the cryptic note that had changed everything. It was a tangible link to a story that had become a legend. Years later, an elderly Sarah, her hair now streaked with gray, would sometimes visit the museum and stand before the guestbook. She would trace the outline of her sister's name, the beautiful, looping cursive, a ghost of a hand that had once been so full of life. She would remember the laughter, the music, the scent of roses in the air. She would remember the joy, not the sorrow. The pain of her loss would always be there, a dull ache in her heart, but it was now overshadowed by the warmth of her memories. Sun would set over the rolling hills of Montana, casting long shadows across the valley. The wind would whisper through the pines, carrying with it the faint, distant echo of a love story, a tragedy, and a secret that had finally been laid to rest. The story of Eleanor Vance was a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, the truth, however painful, has a way of finding its way into the light. And in the end, it is not the darkness that endures, but the echo of a life that was loved, a memory that is cherished, a spirit that is never truly gone. In the quiet solitude of the Montana landscape, the final, enduring truth of the Eleanor Van's story was not found in the details of her death, but in the enduring power of love and remembrance. The Guestbook had unlocked the what, the where, and the who, but it was the people left behind, in their quiet acts of healing and remembrance, who provided the why. It was a story about the enduring human need for connection, for truth, and for the hope that even after the most devastating of storms, the sun will, eventually, rise again. The echo in the hills was not one of sorrow, but of a love that had, in its own tragic way, found a way to last forever.